Hello everyone in philosophy and welcome to this short little video tutorial which will give you a little review of the upcoming midterm by looking at the study guide. I'll go through it with you and share some insights as much as I can about the midterm exam so you can best prepare for it and do a great job on it. Sharing my screen with you, I will be going into Brightspace. And in our class, you'll see there posted for you the midterm exam study guide. And I will put it on the full screen so we can take a close-up look at it. Now, the midterm study guide contains pretty much everything that you would need to know in order to be successful with the midterm. It's just an overview of everything we've done so far in the class. In addition to the chapters of the book, also the information I did at the very beginning. It's very much connected to the notes that I use and post in Brightspace, as well as review with you during our tutorials. If you have been watching all of the tutorials and doing the reading, you should be fine with this midterm. It is not intended to be overwhelming or intimidating, just to be sure that you are with us and following in the course, okay? If you look at the study guide, it will tell you exactly where each item can be found, whether they're in the notes that I post or from the textbook. Now, you can be using a possibility of 3 versions of the textbook. And with that in mind, I have listed what pages they're on depending upon the version you may be using. If you are using the oldest one, the 5th edition, then they are the pages that are first listed, the ones in regular font, okay? If you are using the 6th edition, the one after the 5th, they are the ones that are in bold. So the pages you see in bold would be from the 6th edition where you can find it. And then if you're using the newest one, the 7th edition, they would be the pages listed in italics. Notice that none of the material is really all that far from each other. As I said, all 3 versions of the text are not that different from each other, the 5th, 6th, and 7th. So no matter which one you have, if you're looking through it, you're going to find the information pretty much about the same place in all 3 of the editions of the book. All right, let's get started and review this list here. The first on the list here, notice it has a little indicator, know this well. Yes, because these are 2 items that are often confused, and I want to make sure that you can distinguish the difference between them. When we talk about the difference between objective and subjective perspectives, often we are looking at the part of philosophy known as value theory. Most of philosophical theories in value theory are either objective or subjectively based. Now, when we consider something to be objective, we're saying that it is what it is in and of itself. It just is what it is. There's no outside factors or circumstances that would have any effect on that. If we say we're looking at it from a subjective perspective, then we're looking at it more from a varying kind of perspective. That means it would depend on the circumstances or the outcomes or the people involved or things like that in order to view it. The different branches of philosophy, we talked about 4 of the most significant branches of philosophy that we took a look at in this class. The first one was called metaphysics. That's the philosophy of reality. The second one was epistemology, which is the philosophy of knowledge. The third one is value theory, where we look at aesthetics, which is art and beauty, as well as ethics. Finally, the 4th one we mentioned just a little briefly is logic. Logic is where we find critical thinking, which is the focus of our course. Logic is also more of a tool with which you do philosophy rather than much of a branch of philosophy in itself. We ended up giving definitions to philosophy and critical thinking. We said that philosophy is the attempt to think rationally and critically about the most important questions. We even had an exercise where we listed our most important questions. So critical thinking is skilled and active analysis and interpretation of information. Okay. Now, make sure you can distinguish between those two when you see them. So if I write one of them, you should be able to know which one of them is philosophy and which one is critical thinking. Empiricism and rationalism. That comes from epistemology. Remember, we said empiricism is when you know things through your five senses, and rationalism is where you get to know things, where you gain knowledge through intellect alone. Okay, at least some of the knowledge comes from your intellect. The Socratic method of doing philosophy. This is where we get this from Socrates, from his dialogues, where he talks to other people. And basically, it's a series of questions, questioning what people say in order to analyze what they've said and get at the heart of it so you can reveal the strengths and weaknesses of it. What did Socrates say about philosophy? Well, he said that philosophy begins with wonder. Wonder is the key place. Once we have this sense of wonder about the world, trying to figure out what's going on, what it's all about, that's where we can begin philosophy. His quote about the examined life is a very important one. He said that the unexamined life is not worth living, meaning that what purpose can you really determine in life if you don't take an opportunity to examine the deepness of life itself? The obstacles to critical thinking were at the end of chapter 1, okay, and there were many of them listed. We have a few of them here: egocentrism, sociocentrism, stereotypes, relativism, wishful thinking, blind obedience to reality, ignorance to information. All of those things can create problems for critical thinking. Precision, vagueness, overgenerality, and ambiguity. Those come from the chapter about language, where we were focusing our attention on making sure that our language is very specific and precise to avoid any problems with people understanding or interpreting my meaning of them. Okay. Semantics is the linguistic study of the development of meanings of words. Hermeneutics, on the other hand, is a philosophical technique. It's a philosophical technique that takes a look at interpreting texts, art, or events from the past to try and determine what their original meanings were. We do this by taking a look at things that were going on when things were written, or when things happened, or when things were created in art, so we can get a sense of what the people who wrote them or did them or created them were thinking, what their world was about. We used a German term called Sitzenleben, situation in life, which helps us to understand what goes on in hermeneutics. Bypassing is the incorrect assumption that meanings are in words rather than the people who use them. We went through some examples of how that's not actually the case. Words are actually in people. People create the meanings. That's where we find out what something means, by understanding the person who's using the words or the language themselves. The words and the language on their own don't necessarily communicate anything to people who don't share that meaning. Polarization is the common tendency to describe things in terms of extreme opposites. Why we call it polar, right? If you were standing on a North Pole, someone who would be on the South Pole would be the extreme opposite part of the world than you are. So on polarization, we're trying to understand things in terms of simply just black and white, big and small, and negating the details in between. The types and strategies for defining, you'll find those in the textbook, the different ways that we look at definitions, whether they be definitions that come from the dictionary, lexical ones, definitions that we create, on our own to stipulate meanings or definitions that try to persuade people of things. All of those, you'll see that there's a nice little box there that has a listing of all of them on those pages. Euphemisms are softer sounding words that kind of cover a harsh reality. Sometimes they're helpful, like in situations where the harsh reality might be a little unpleasant for someone. We can use a euphemism to make it sound a little softer. Like instead of saying somebody is dead, we could say that they have passed. Okay? Hedging is kind of a little like euphemism, where we kind of undercut, like when we cut a hedge, we undercut the claim, like we're saying it's not as big of a deal as it might initially sound. Emotive language is language that plays on our emotions, right? We find it a lot in political speech. We find it sometimes in sales. We find it often in things like when people are trying to convince us, persuade us of certain things. For example, maybe in religious dialogue, maybe like a sermon or a homily, right? People who try and stir or rise our emotions to make us feel or believe a certain thing. Linguistic lethargy is when we are lazy about language, when we refuse to acknowledge that language continues to change. So we need to be always active in our approach to understanding meanings and language. The difference between fact, opinion, ideas, speculation, and assumptions. We said that we can find all of these potentially in an argument. So it's good to be able to understand what each of them implies and means. A fact, we said that anything is a fact when it is empirically verifiable. Remember, the word empiricism relates to the five senses. So if we say something is empirically verifiable, it means that we can verify it by seeing it, touching it, tasting it, smelling it, hearing it, so forth. All right, so our five senses verify this is the case. Facts are pretty solid ground on which to base our beliefs. They're great foundations for an argument. If you're presenting facts as your evidence, it's usually hard to beat them. Opinions, on the other hand, are a lot more subject. They're more personal than facts, but they do come in three different types. Statements of conjecture are what we normally think about when it comes to opinions. They're statements of personal taste. I think this is the best music. I think this is the best beach, and so forth. So those are probably not very helpful to use in an argument. But there are other kinds of opinions that might be. Opinions that come from experts. Remember, we used the example of how in a court case, a fingerprint expert's opinions would be more valid than just a normal person's opinion about fingerprints. Or a medical doctor's opinion about a diagnosis would be more helpful than someone who doesn't have a medical background. And then finally, we have opinions that are established through precedents, like legal opinions, where something was decided upon already, and we're founding our continuing dialogue and direction on the opinion that has already been established as a proper opinion. Ideas, well, they're in our heads, and they usually take the form of things like suggestions and proposals. We often hear the word ought in front of an idea. Hey, you ought to watch more comedy movies. That'll put you in a better mood. All right. That's what ideas. And ideas are fine as long as we get a good representation of where they're coming from, whose idea it is. Some ideas seem more trustworthy than others. Speculation is a form of guesswork. And I use the analogy of climbing up a tree to help us understand that. When you are climbing up the trunk of the tree, you're at the thickest part of the tree. So that would be a reasoned speculation. There's good reason to believe that smoking cigarettes is bad for your health. Okay, so even though I don't have the data in front of me and I'm speculating that claim, it's a pretty good claim. Okay, the further we get up on the tree, go out into like a branch or a limb that might not be able to support our weight, the more we might have to worry. So unreasoned speculation is kind of like just throwing guesses here or there without having any good reason to speculate. That's not very helpful in an argument. Assumptions are coming to a conclusion with little or no evidence whatsoever at all. Doesn't stop people from doing it. We looked at a short little video from an old TV show where someone was saying what happens when we assume. So it's not a good idea to come to a conclusion if we don't really have much good evidence to base it on. Always good to have something to base our claims on. Otherwise, they will be, as the name implies, baseless. Propositions are statements that make up arguments, right? They are words that make claims, propose things that can either be true or false. So if we have a declaratory sentence, a statement that declares something, I declare this to be the case or this to be true, right? If it is something that could possibly be proven as either true or false, disproven as false, and it makes a claim, then it's a proposition. We went through some examples to see what propositions look like. Some of our propositions and arguments are premises. Premises are the words or statements of evidence that we use for our point of view or our beliefs. Some propositions are conclusions. They are what we come to as a result of the evidence. As a result of my premises, I come to this conclusion. Unsupported assertions, illustrations, and explanations are pieces and bits of information that can be helpful and tell us things, but they do not in themselves make up an argument. If we're going to make an assertion and we want it to be taken seriously, it would be helpful if we support it with evidence and information. If not, then it's not really an argument. If we're going to illustrate what something is really all about, we get to create a picture of it, but we're not really proving it as any particular conclusion. And when we explain something, it's the same thing. We show someone what something is, but we're not really giving evidence for why it is what it is. Then we came to fallacies, okay? We said a number of things about fallacies. The most important thing was how they camouflage themselves in an argument. And the most important thing is not to understand what they are, but rather to spot them, to be able to say, hey, that's a fallacy. That's going to invalidate this argument. Know the categories of fallacies very well. We listed 4 of them, okay? The fallacies of presumption, which build on unproven things, okay, and bringing about conclusions. So if someone is trying to rest their conclusion on something that hasn't really been proven, that would be a fallacy of presumption. We also talked the fallacies of relevance, where we create a problem with an argument when we base our reasons for believing something on something that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. It's irrelevant. We also mentioned linguistic fallacies, or what we call the fallacies of ambiguity. That's where language is used in ways that confuse us. We looked at the quintessential example of a fallacy of ambiguity called equivocation, where a word can be used with multiple meanings that can confuse people, in the video called Who's On First by the 2 comedians from years ago. The final category of fallacies was formal fallacies. Formal fallacies are about how the argument is just not structured well. It's not put together in a way that brings about a logical conclusion. And we're going to talk a little bit more about logical fallacies when we get to deductive reasoning after the midterm. But just know that it's the category of fallacies based on the way an argument is structured, okay, its particular form. Now, be familiar with enough of one of the fallacies of insufficient evidence, okay? You don't have enough reason to believe something, to give an example of one, all right? And you'll find information in the textbook here, all right? That might be one of the short answers on the exam. right? Assessing the credibility of sources. Remember, we said credibility is the first step in trying to analyze an argument. Analyzing an argument takes time and effort. There's no reason to spend the time and the effort if we're not dealing with credible sources. In other words, if we're basing an argument on fake news or information from someone who can't be trusted, then we can pretty much negate having to worry much about the validity of the argument right from the beginning. We don't really have to worry too much about the argument if it's coming from a source that is not credible. And then remember, we used a court case to try and help us to sort through how we understand credibility. The more we analyze the situation, the facts, the circumstances, the details, the people, the more we can help establishing credibility. Cohency is the persuasive force of an argument. An argument is very coherent if it's very persuasive. Now, a very coherent argument doesn't necessarily mean it's a good one, because sometimes we can be persuaded with bad information, all right? But a coherent argument is a very persuasive. Value claims are claims people make based on the values they have. We use the example of people quoting from scripture, like quoting from the Bible, to base their arguments on, which is fine as long as you're talking to someone who shares your beliefs about the Bible, but not very helpful if you're not talking to someone who doesn't, who shares those beliefs. So it's best for an argument not to rest itself on value claims, because that limits its ability to be accepted and appreciated by a larger audience of people. Independent versus interdependent evidence. We said something is independently good when it can stand by itself, like in a court case, fingerprint evidence or DNA evidence, something like that. Interdependent evidence is evidence that must rest upon something else. So we can say that in a court case, a defendant was seen at the scene of the crime, but that evidence rests on the credibility of the witness. As long as the witness can be established as credible, then that evidence works together well. If it doesn't, well, not so helpful. I think we use the example of the two books leaning against each other. If we open up the book and it stands by itself, that means independently it can stand alone. If it rests against the other one, then it's interdependently standing up with the help of the other one. If one part of it goes, the other part does too. Circumstantial evidence is okay evidence to use as long as you have enough of it and it does all point to the same conclusion. So if we have 12 pieces of circumstantial evidence in our argument, and only 3 of them point to the same conclusion that we want, well, that's not very strong circumstantial evidence. But if we have 12 pieces of circumstantial evidence in an argument, and 9 of the 12 point to the same conclusion, that is pretty helpful evidence, even though it's circumstantial in nature. So it's not so much about the evidence being circumstantial, it's about how much of it exists and how similar it might be in where it's pointing. Conditional claims, as the word implies, is a claim that works only if a condition is met, right? We will have our party at the beach today as long as it doesn't rain. So yes, there's going to be a party at the beach today, but we must meet the condition of no rain. If it rains, the condition hasn't been met, so the claim of having a party at the beach is going to fall through. The scope of a claim is how comprehensive the claim is, how much it will cover. So for example, if I have an argument that can be accepted no matter what part of the world I'm presenting it, that's a pretty comprehensive argument, right? I'm covering a lot. If I have an argument that can be applied in multiple situations, that's better than an argument that can only be applied in one situation, okay? So the more versatile an argument is, the wider the scope of a claim that supports it. So the exam itself is going to have 39 questions, and there'll be one bonus question, Okay. Now, 36 are multiple choice questions. Simple enough, very straightforward. 3 of them will be short answers where you will have to write in the answer. So unlike the quizzes, you won't know your final score until I go through and look at what you wrote for the short answers in the quizzes. Okay. If as you're studying you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me, to send me an email. I will be more than happy to help you, but don't send the email 5 minutes before the exam. That won't be helpful. Okay. All right. Good luck on the exam, and I will talk to you again in our next video tutorial. Bye-bye.